An interval is a measure of the distance between two notes. The way to calculate an interval is to count how many notes there are from the first note to the second, including the first note. For example, the interval from C to F is a fourth because there are 4 notes from C to F, C, D, E, and F. The slightly confusing part is that the interval from a note to itself, say from C to C, is not 0 but 1. We don't call this interval a first, but instead we call it a unison. The same process works for upward and downward intervals. C up to G is a fifth, C down to A is a third, C up to B is a seventh, and C down to C is not an eighth, but an octave. Intervals larger than an octave are called compound intervals. In general, we abbreviate compound intervals to what they would be within a single octave. So the interval from middle C to a high G is technically a 12th, but we just call that a fifth. There are 2 exceptions. An octave plus a second is usually called a ninth, and an octave plus a third is usually called a tenth. The numbered part of an interval, second, third, fifth, etc., is called the generic part of the interval. The generic interval just measures the distance between the letter names. The interval from C to G is a fifth, no matter if it's a C sharp and G natural or C double sharp and G triple flat. To measure the absolute distance, we add a quality to the interval. Unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves are called perfect intervals. A C natural to a C natural is a perfect unison, abbreviated P1. C to F is a perfect fourth, C to G is a perfect fifth, and C to a higher C is a perfect octave. There are 2 ways to tell if an interval is perfect. You can count half steps, a perfect fifth is 7 half steps, or you can think of a major scale. If you think of the lower note as the tonic of a major scale, then the interval is perfect if the next note is a part of that major scale. Seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths can be minor or major. All intervals above the tonic in a major scale are major or perfect intervals. If we turn this major scale into a natural minor scale, the perfect intervals stay the same, but the major intervals become minor intervals. The exception is the second, which is a major second in both scales. By the midterm exam, you should be able to calculate the interval between 2 notes immediately. The best way to get fast at this is to picture the intervals on a piano keyboard or possibly your own instrument. A trick is to use the most common intervals as guides. From any note, you should know a major third, a perfect fifth, and an octave. You can then compare other intervals to these. Say you are asked to label the interval from F sharp to D. You know that F sharp to C sharp is a perfect fifth, and since D is a half step above C sharp, you know that F sharp to D is a minor sixth. You may have noticed that to make a minor interval major, you enlarge it by a half step without changing the note names. If you take a minor interval and instead shrink it by a half step, you get a diminished interval. F sharp to D flat is a diminished sixth. This is not an interval you will encounter frequently. Notice that even though this interval sounds like the perfect fifth from F sharp to C sharp, it is not a fifth at all. The generic interval is always calculated by counting the letter names between the 2 notes. A diminished sixth and perfect fifth are enharmonically equivalent, but not the same. If you take a major interval and enlarge it by a half step, you get an augmented interval. F natural to D sharp is an augmented sixth. If you start with a perfect interval, enlarging it by a half step makes an augmented interval, and shrinking it by a half step makes a diminished interval. You can never get from a perfect interval to a major or minor interval, or vice versa. There's no such thing as a perfect third or a major fourth. Now let's quickly look at consonants and dissonants. All intervals are either consonant or dissonant. Consonant intervals are stable, while dissonant intervals are unstable and require resolution. Perfect unisons, fifths, and octaves are consonant. Major and minor thirds and sixths are also consonant. Seconds, sevenths, and all augmented and diminished intervals are dissonant. The tricky one is the perfect fourth. This is a dissonance.